The excitement and hype around DirectX 12 was palpable, and the API was first demoed in March 2014, yes, that long ago, but it was released about a year later. The API was promising many things: better CPU utilization, a lower overhead, and richer, more detailed worlds, and bringing many more features to the table as well for developers to take advantage of. At the time of DirectX 12's launch, the Haswell architecture was current, and a couple of months later we saw the launch of Intel's i7 6700K, which was the flagship for the mainstream market. It featured 4 CPU cores and 8 threads in the now infamous Skylake architecture, and represented the pinnacle of gaming performance. The number of threads and CPU cores now though is dwarfed by modern alternatives. My name's Paul, and in this RedGamingTech.com video, we're going to be investigating how DirectX 12 and Vulkan compare against their older contemporaries such as DirectX 11, and furthermore investigating how the number of CPU cores and threads plays into the performance equation. I did a very similar video last year with the then modern i7 8700K and the Nvidia GTX 1080 Ti. But in this video, we're going to be upping the ante with the i9 9900K and an RTX 2080 Ti as one test platform, and also adding in AMD hardware into the equation as well. This is also an article, so you can find a link to it in the description of the video, where I go deeper into some of the graphs. Simply for brevity's sake, this video would end up being extraordinarily long if I went into all verbal detail. The push for low-level APIs was really spurred on by AMD's Mantle, developed specifically for their own Radeon hardware. When the API launched, we did some testing for the then current cards such as the Radeon R9 280, and even on mid-range GPUs and CPUs there was a tantalizing glimpse into the performance increase possible for a modern API. Since then, for the PC, there are 2 low-level APIs which have been really developed. DirectX 12, pioneered by Microsoft and is the successor to DX11 as you may have guessed. And also Vulkan. This is curated by the Kronos Group and acts as a successor to sorts to OpenGL. The difference between the two is that DX12 runs across the Windows environment only, so Windows 10 and Xbox One, whereas Vulkan is platform agnostic and runs on even older versions of Windows such as Windows 7, and also supports other operating systems such as Linux. An API, Application Programming Interface, has an extremely important job. It facilitates the communication between the software, so a game for example, and the hardware itself. Lower level APIs such as DirectX 12 reduce the overhead compared to legacy APIs such as DX11, and also have less abstraction and much better at taking advantage of more threads and CPU cores, though the APIs accomplish this with a few trade-offs. The first is that the developer needs to do more work compared to writing DX11 code, and if the game doesn't need additional performance, it's quite frankly easier to just go with the DX11 route. This means that multi-GPU is much harder to achieve than with DX11, where an SLI profile could easily be created by Nvidia. It's one of the reasons that multi-GPUs these days is much rarer, though DX12 can support mGPU, and indeed can even mix and match GPU configurations. So you could have an RTX 2080 Ti and an Intel iGPU in the same system. In the closing weeks of 2019, there are still lots of newly released games designed specifically only for DirectX 11, and it will be curious how things change with the release of next generation consoles in the next 12 months from now. We're using an i9 9900K kindly provided by Intel as our CPU of choice, and pairing this with a motherboard provided by MSI, an MPG Gaming Pro Carbon motherboard. We're going to use the motherboard's BIOS to enable or disable CPU cores as well as the hyperthreading capabilities of the processor. So for example, if we disable the hyperthreading capabilities of the 9900K, it will act more like a 9700K, albeit with additional level 3 cache. This means that we get a more easily configured system, and so while technically speaking it would give more accurate results if we were swapping in and out the processor, for convenience sake, plus as well just the ability to procure the number of CPU samples that we would need here, plus running them all at the same clock frequency, it's much more realistic for us just to use the 9900K. We are also using an RTX 2080 Ti, which has been purchased thanks to our generous support on Patreon, so once again I would like to extend my thanks to those who have been supporting us over these last months. I've gone ahead and increased the power limit to 111%, the highest our Gigabyte WindForce model goes, and played around with the fan curve a little. When the GPU is at full load, it hits between 1900 and 1930 MHz on the core clock, but I haven't manually overclocked it with offsets, either to the memory or the core. The second GPU is an AMD Radeon RX 5700 graphics card. You can check out the full review of this GPU linked in the description. This was running at stock and is a reference card which AMD provided us for testing. Although given the reference design of the GPU, custom cards will likely be capable of boosting to higher speeds, and of course the RX 5700 XT would be even faster. Using the AMD RX 5700 in these tests will allow us to see how core counts and APIs affect AMD's Navi silicon. We will run benchmarks with 3 of the most popular resolutions, 1080p, 1440p, and finally 4K, though we put much of our emphasis on 1080p, as we are attempting to analyse the role in both the number of threads to performance as well as the APIs themselves. I have also included a few 720p results for particularly demanding titles on the graphics card, such as Remedy's Control. Other than that, on the hardware side of things, the games have all been patched to whatever the latest available version is, using whatever distributing platform they're on, such as Steam or Epic Game Launcher. And finally, Windows has the usual patches applied as of November 2019. In the case of the footage that was captured for this accompanying video, a second rig was used with a dedicated capture card, so no additional load was put on the system. We will also be testing with a mixture of built-in benchmarks and manual runs. On the benchmarks that are run without the GPU model being specifically stated, those results will be for the RTX 2080 Ti. Results for the RX 5700 will be listed in the chart title. Focusing one moment longer on the CPU side of things, we have made the decision to lock all of the CPU cores to 5 GHz because it was a choice between that or the CPU running at default behavior. The i9 9900K with 1 or 2 CPU cores loaded runs at 5 GHz, but with more CPU cores loaded, the clock frequency diminishes. So with all of the 8 CPU cores running, it hits just 4.7 GHz. So the thing is, we had to decide, well, was that a better representation of scaling across CPU cores, or was it better to get consistent data by having a locked clock frequency? In the end, I decided to lock the processor frequency to 5 GHz across all cores because I did not want the clock frequency to be part of the performance equation. The goal here is to see how the performance scales with different numbers of CPU cores enabled, plus as well, of course, to see the performance of low-level APIs such as DirectX 12 versus older APIs such as DirectX 11. 3DMark's API overhead test is first. This test was first implemented in 2015, in the infancy of DirectX 12, to compare the then fledgling API to legacy DX11 code. Also back then, AMD's Mantle was still a thing before AMD really stopped development on it. It has since been used, of course, as the basis for Vulkan by the Kronos Group. Speaking of Vulkan, 3DMark's API overhead test has since been updated, supporting the new Vulkan API. Right off the bat, there are some interesting results for the test. Enabling or disabling hyperthreading on the 9900K doesn't really benefit performance that much on Vulkan. It does squeeze a little bit more out of DirectX 12, but not by a huge degree. The lower core count configurations though, 2 cores with hyperthreading just lacks the real grunt of 4 real cores. In DX11 single thread, the results barely change with extra available threads. Well, not really surprising. DirectX 11 multi-thread does its best to make use of the extra resources, but quite frankly gets stomped by both modern APIs. I've also decided to include the Ryzen 7 3700X versus the i9 9900K results with our RX 5700, so you can see that the CPU does extremely well. We'll investigate more Ryzen 3000 stuff soon, but you can see that the story is quite similar with the RX 5700 as the RTX 2080 Ti, though DX11 MT and ST results are essentially a wash. Margin of error. The next synthetic is Uni Engine's Superposition, and no, I did not make a mistake during these benchmarks. This is entirely focused on pushing the GPU in the system as hard as possible. Your CPU can basically go for a coffee while it's running. 1080p Extreme is actually more taxing on the GPU than 4K optimized, with the exception of VRAM. So there's a little more variation when going down to just a single or dual CPU configuration at 4K optimized. I think of the i9 9900K with just a single CPU core running as a Pentium 4 that's actually been to the gym. Now let's focus on the game's performance with DirectX 12 versus DX11, using the full 8 cores of the i9 9900K, but toggling hyperthreading on versus off. In one graph, it's easy to see that Battlefield 5 is one game you just do not want to run in DirectX 11 mode. Averages and max FPS was considerably higher, and the game title just does not like hyperthreading too much. We did some additional testing for this in our Does Hyperthreading Hurt Game Performance article and video, and Battlefield 5 was one of the few games which was so dramatic with this behaviour. I'll link it of course in the description of the video. What about AMD? Well, it's a similar story. Even with the RX 5700 and its more modest performance, DX12 is consistently a better choice than the older API. 116 FPS for DX12 with just 4 cores and 8 threads, versus 87 for the average, and also leads a 5 FPS in the minimum. Remedy's Control is up next, and it uses the Northlight engine for its fancy schmancy graphics. We've disabled ray tracing for these tests, because Control already hits the GPU with a sledgehammer even at lower resolutions. Our RTX 2080 Ti hit 100% usage during these tests even at just 1080p, and given the tests were at the beginning of the game, we can see that we didn't really put that much strain comparably on the CPU. Looking at these results, the average performance of the two areas at the start of the game, consistently, DX12 loses in performance to DX11. Of course, with DX11 you cannot enable shiny effects like ray tracing, and Nvidia's DLSS, which once again I'll remind you are not enabled for our DirectX 12 testing. Gears 5 is our next test, which of course was built from the ground up to support both Windows 10 and DX12, with a mixture of manual runs using the initial run where you get the skiff, along with the game's built-in benchmark. Or 4 or less cores, you'll definitely notice microstutter creeping in and spoiling your experience. You'll want at least 4 physical cores in the ideal world. We attempted to test with only 2 CPU cores active, with hyperthreading disabled and the game just wouldn't even load. Using the built-in benchmark, we can see how the performance of the game scales across resolution and core counts. Just like the last test, we disabled the minimum FPS target because otherwise, the game will use dynamic resolution scaling to reduce GPU workloads when things get extra tough. As you can see, even the RTX 2080 Ti struggles to maintain 60 FPS with the game running at 4K. I will admit, the announcement of Capcom remaking Resident Evil 2 had me super excited, and it's amazing how good this game looks and its performance. There's no performance utility in the game, an annoying trait of many Capcom titles, so instead we have to rely on manual runs. As you can see, DirectX 11 allows the game to run with only a single CPU core, albeit with terrible stuttering and instability. We had the game crash at least once like this. 2 physical cores helps a bit, but still a train wreck to play. The difference between 2 cores and 2 threads to enabling hyperthreading, giving 2 cores and 4 threads is huge. The minimum FPS literally increases by about 6 times. And looking at DirectX 12 versus DX11, the game definitely runs better with DirectX 11 mode in Nvidia hardware, particularly at lower core counts. We were testing Resident Evil 2 with the graphics settings at the highest, but opted to keep only 1 GB of textures to keep consistency with our other benchmarking database. Right, well now that we've looked over the data, what type of conclusions can we come to? Well, there's an awful lot of data to get through here, but we might as well start somewhere, and I figure the easiest place is hyperthreading enabled or disabled. Now we have done a dedicated investigation of that in the past, I'll link it in the video description, but the bottom line is that in most applications it really doesn't matter that much if you have hyperthreading enabled or disabled. There are some exceptions. So titles such as CSGO do, generally speaking, benefit slightly more if you disable hyperthreading, and also we see very similar results with Battlefield 5 as well. But typically speaking, if you have a 9900K, I wouldn't recommend, unless you're like a hardcore gamer that is competing in like a competition or something like that, you really spend that much effort to go into the BIOS to disable hyperthreading to then play a game. Honestly, in day-to-day operations, you're probably better with hyperthreading enabled anyway, even if you are playing a game, because if the additional threads being available, if let's say your antivirus decides to do something, Windows decides to do an update, and so on, it's just nice to have that additional performance. Shifting to the core count side of the equation, and we're in a very interesting time in the market right now. As of the time that I'm recording this, the closing weeks of 2019, the highest end SKU from Intel is the i9 9900K. In the early part of 2020, we're set to see the launch of Comet Lake, which will be still based on the Skylake architecture, albeit allegedly increasing the clock frequencies slightly more, but perhaps more importantly for this topic anyway, also increasing the number of CPU cores to 10 cores at 20 threads. And AMD are already there, of course. They have processors such as the 3900 and the 3950X. The Ryzen 3000 series therefore goes up to 16 CPU cores, and that's certainly not even discussing something like Threadripper. Ultimately, the next generation consoles will likely have a rather large impact in how games are developed for the next generation of PC titles as well. The Xbox Scarlett and the PlayStation 5 will both be using a derivative of Zen 2. And unlike Jaguar, which is clocked at a fairly sedate speed, the PS4 base console has 1.6 GHz, the PS4 Pro is clocked at 1.75 GHz, and the fastest CPU out of the bunch is the Xbox One X, clocked at 2.3 GHz. But even so, Jaguar was designed for a low performance, low power envelope type of usage scenario. And while it's done a pretty good job in the consoles, it's going to be absolutely nothing compared to the screaming performance of these next generation systems. This will allow developers to create richer gaming experience, larger, more open worlds, better AI, better graphics, better physics, and so on and so on. The problem is though, I can't benchmark a game which has not been released yet. And ultimately these titles most likely won't launch until the closing months of 2020. For budget gamers, CPUs such as the i5 9600K and the Ryzen 3600 are pretty compelling and the minimum that we would recommend if you're buying new gear. The later works great in cheaper AM4 motherboards such as the B450, and at only around $200 it comes with its own cooler, making it the perfect option for those wanting a wallet-friendly alternative to the streaming high-end CPUs of 2019, such as the 3950X. We went into much more detail on an all-AMD build featuring the Ryzen 7 3700X with its 8 cores, 16 threads, and the RX 5700 too, if you are curious. As for APIs, the adoption rate of DirectX 12 and Vulkan is speeding up, which is only a good thing for PC gamers. Owners of SLI setups might be cursing the lack of support for your second graphics card, but with ray tracing becoming normal in the next generation of consoles, visually we should see some impressive things. Both of these newfangled APIs improve performance in games such as Battlefield 5, even running on hardware with fewer active threads. And remember, DX12 and Vulkan aren't just designed to talk to more CPU cores, but also have lower performance impact on the hardware with less overhead. Not all games have a clear advantage for DX12 over DX11, but in general my default behaviour now is just to turn on DX12 and not really think about it too much. Anyway, hopefully you have enjoyed the video. If you did, then please leave a like on the video because it helps us out a ton, and also share the video with your friends as well. You can also find this as an article, which is of course linked in the video description, along with links to our social media, so if you want to give us a follow, that would be great, and our Patreon. As a quick reminder, this video was made possible in part thanks to our generous Patreon supporters. So thanks to your help, we have managed to procure hardware such as the RTX 2080 Ti, which was used extensively in this benchmarking, and as well the Ryzen 7 3700X, which was used a little bit in this video, but is going to be extensively used in an upcoming project. So once again, thank you very much to those who have been supporting us on Patreon. But with all of that said, I hope you have an amazing day. Take care of yourselves. Bye for now.